Well, good morning, everybody. I think this has to be one of my favorite places to be of all. I just love being with God's people. And yesterday there was a crowd gathered together to honor Linda Dick, and it's just so good to be in the same room because you have such good friends no matter where we are in our Christian walk, that when we get together we just pick up right where we left off, even if it had been years prior. And when you get a group, it's like you all, I say you're not friendly enough and you all just keep talking and don't want to sit down. Well, that's the way it was yesterday. We just really enjoy each other's fellowship. Well, I learned something about what other people think about me. And I want to share this before we get into the sermon today because it really kind of surprised me. People think I'm funny. And I mean funny ha-ha, not funny weird. Although there may be some that think I'm weird too. So, sound man's in timeout again. But how I discovered this was, now you people here know this, but we record this, we put it on the internet. We have people evidently from all over the world that watch us here in Lexington. But my church time, I volunteer this. And I have a working job through the week like a lot of people do, and my job requires me to go out to clients' businesses. And not too long ago, I was out at a client's business working away, and I don't have a fancy glamorous job. It's really, people think it's boring, like how can you do this? But as I was working away, and this is a long-time client, I've worked with them for 25 years, and I had never seen them do this before. In the department where I was working, people started pulling up chairs. I mean, not just that department. The IT guy was there, the head IT guy. And all these people come wandering in and they're pulling up chairs looking at me. And I was really kind of puzzled because, that day I was working on depreciation expense of fixed assets. Woohoo, that's exciting. They're all lining up and gathering around, and people are coming in with cups of coffee and stuff, and it's like, what? I said, I turned around and looked at him, and they go, say something. I go, what? They go, we think you are just so funny, say something. And it was like, and another client recently told me that, so I guess I'm funnier than I thought. But I say that to say this, that when I go through the story that we're going to go through today, I hope to make it maybe a little more humorous and a little more personable. And I try to do that when I talk about the people of the Bible. And you've heard me say before that a lot of times man on the street has this idea of the people in the Bible being, kind of museum pieces, kind of dusty in cases and don't touch, because they're perfect. And they're not like us at all, but yes, they are. And I would like to illustrate a point about God's grace, actually, a point about God's grace as told through the story of Mephibosheth. Who? Yeah. Now, you know me, and I like to talk about people of the Bible, and I've done a lot of biographies of interesting people, and for some reason, in all of that study, I never heard of this guy, never heard of him in relationship to King David of all people. I've read a lot about King David, but I had never come across this story. But I was reading something that a pastor from another denomination had written to illustrate the story of Mephibosheth and the concept of grace. And today's title, if you need a title, we don't have programs today, sorry about that, but the title is God's Grace Carries Us. And the story is found in 2 Samuel chapter 9. And I'll start out by reading the first 4 verses. King David asked, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of Saul. They used the word servant back then. We might say employee, but there was this guy that worked for Saul, and his name was Ziba, Z-I-B-A. And they called him to appear before King David, and the king said, are you Ziba? And he says, your servant, or we might say, yes, sir, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Do you know of anybody still left, a descendant of Saul, that I might be kind to them? And Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. Just one. There is still one left. He is crippled in both feet. Well, where is he? The king asked. And Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-Debar. L-O-D-E-B-A-R. I don't know where that is. My reference here says it's somewhere in the Transjordan territory. Thinking not prime real estate. So what is going on here? What's the backstory to all this? Well, the exact timing of the story is really not known. And a lot of stories in the Bible, we don't know the exact date. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But David at this point has been on his throne for many years. Remember, he was 30 when he actually took the throne. And this is many, many years later, and I can tell you why I know this, because I can do math. But he is probably in his 50s at this point, middle-aged. And at this point in his life, he has conquered most of his enemies, and he is reflecting back to a promise he made to Jonathan. Now, who's Jonathan? Who was Jonathan? His best friend, who was also son of Saul, crazy, loony King Saul. And not only was he the loony king, he was David's loony father-in-law. Talk about your dysfunctional, crazy family. But David and Jonathan shared a special bond, and he was reflecting back to a promise he made many, many years ago to Jonathan. And it's found, if you want to look it up sometime, it's 1 Samuel 20:15, where Jonathan is speaking to David, and he makes him promise some different things. But in verse 15, he says, do not ever cut off your kindness from my family. Please, always be kind to my family. So now David has discovered there is one guy left, Mephibosheth, and he is crippled. What happened to Mephibosheth? Well, we find the answer to that back in 2 Samuel 4:4, if you want to check it out later. But Mephibosheth would never forget the day. Word quickly spread through the countryside that King Saul, his grandfather, and Prince Jonathan, his dad, were dead, and now David is king. At the house of Jonathan, this is not only reason for grief, because Mephibosheth had just lost his grandfather and his father, but it was a time for panic as well. In that day, it was customary that if a king took the throne, he'd often eliminate the family of the king before him. Cut down on the competition. Cut down on conspiracy. In that day, little Mephibosheth was sitting on the floor. He was 5 years old. And he was oblivious to all, but soon his nurse, or his nanny, as we might call her now, bursts into the room, grabs him up, and heads toward the door to get the precious child out of there, fearing someone would be coming for him to do him in. But in doing so, she drops him, crushes his feet, his ankles, and cripples him for his life. Back then, they didn't have orthopedic surgery like they do now that could have put him back together. He believed that there would never be a day that was so impactful on his life and so affect his future. He at one point was destined to become a prince, but now he was destined to live as a pauper, because if you can't walk, you can't earn a living. But Mephibosheth would soon discover that day would come that would make a far greater impact on his life and on his future. It was the day he found grace through King David. Well, let's keep reading the story. Continuing in 2 Samuel 9:5, it says, So King David, after he finds out about him, had him brought, he couldn't come by himself, had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of mine-hearted man had taken him in to give him a place, a roof over his head. And when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, Mephibosheth, he says, your servant, or yes, sir. He replied. And David said, angels say this a lot, but David was saying this, don't be afraid. Now I get from that phase that Mephibosheth wasn't happy about being there. I'm thinking he probably was scared, and I'm thinking King David sensed that. Maybe he was shaking. Maybe it was his voice. But for whatever reason, he came, and David said to him, For I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And the guy's got to be going, what? What? Perhaps he thought that, they found me out. I was hiding. But David, after all these years, has figured me out and has brought me before him to do me in. But David says, For I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. Oh, and wait, there's more, like the guy says on the ad. And you will always eat at my table. Wow. Now, I am a Love Boat head. I love old reruns of Love Boat, which is partly why I wanted to go to Puerto Vallarta. If you remember the show, they were always going to Puerto Vallarta. And if you remember the show, it was not award-worthy. Pretty much every episode was like the other episode before it. It's just they had different people. A morally uplifting show for young children. But it's kind of like a train wreck. And I love watching it. I mean, we watch it on YouTube, and we've run out of YouTube episodes, so I'm thinking about buying the series in case there's some that's not on YouTube. But if you've ever watched the show, I say that to, lest I digress. If you ever watched the show, you'll remember The Captain's Table. Now, this was shot in the 70s and 80s, and cruising has changed a little bit since the Love Boat days. That at that time when the series was made, it was something that just rich people, wealthy people mostly did, and they had wonderful, sumptuous food. Food has kind of changed over the years on cruise ships too, if you've ever been on one. But if you'll recall the Captain's Table, Captain Steubing and Vicky and, the other officers would sit around and invite some guests. And, there's lobster and shrimp and steak, and the little guy is preparing whatever table side, and it's flaming up. And that's what it was like to eat at the Captain's Table on the Love Boat. Now, can you imagine being invited to King David's table personally? The food and the decor and the pomp. And I'm sure Mephibosheth was just like, what? What? How can this be? And he bowed down and said, What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Dead dog. I think in our, if we were writing this today, we'd say dead meat or something else. He goes, I'm nothing. I expected you to, and you are giving me things that I never thought I would ever have. And then the king summoned Ziba, remember the servant, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. Everything that he should have inherited as the prince, as the one in line to the throne, everything that his granddad would have handed down to him, it's his. And I want you, Ziba, to oversee this. The gardens and the flocks and everything, all the money-making stuff that is on this property, it's his. So David gave it away. He gave it away to Ziba. And Ziba never asked for a thing. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crop so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And now Ziba had 15 sons, so all these guys were to help out too. And then Ziba said to the king, whatever you say, I'll do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of his sons. It was like he had adopted him as his own. Can you kind of see where this story is going? Adopted him as his own. And Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah. So he himself had a son. That's how I kind of figured out how old David was, because if he had grown up from 5 when David was 30, now had a son of his own, that's how I figured out by doing the math that David was probably at least in his 50s. And all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth, and he lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. And it says, he throws that, and he was crippled in both feet. I said today's title is God's Grace Carries Us. Now we hear that word thrown around a lot. Grace. When we're in churches, we hear the word grace. Wow, it's even in our title, Cornerstone Grace Fellowship. That's us. But what is grace? How can you define it? And I've got 3 ways to describe it. 1, it is the power behind the gospel. What is the gospel? The good news. Good news of salvation offered to everyone. It is the power that drives the gospel. Secondly, it is the wonder of the gospel. That God should be mindful of me. Wow. That God knows me. He has invited me. And is that not wonderful? Thirdly, it is the distinction of the gospel. I know of no other religion, and maybe there is something out there that I'm not aware of, where it talks about grace. Any other religion on this earth, I'm just not aware of any other one that does. But if I were to put these 3 points and sum it up into my own words, I would say, salvation got us here, but grace keeps us going. Salvation got us here, but it is the grace that keeps us keeping on. As David sat in the king's palace, in verse 1, as he sat in the palace, he thought back to how he had come from a shepherd boy. You know, he's middle-aged. It's pretty safe to say. He's in his 50s, we'll say. And as young men and young women, what do? We dream about the future. And where will I be? What will I do? What will I have? Who will I marry? Who will be my kids? What will be my job? On. And we dream about the future. And then we reach a point in our life where maybe, yes, we still dream. I still dream. But there's something else I do. I look back. You get to a point where you reflect about the past. And I think this is where David was in his life. He reflected about one day sitting in the palace. You know, here I am, king of Israel. And when I was chosen, I was a little wet-haired, snotty-nosed shepherd kid, pretty much. You remember the story. Jesse, his dad, knew Samuel was coming to pick the new king, and he paraded all these sons in front of him, you know, the oldest, good-looking, and, you know, Samuel said, nope. Went through a whole bunch of sons, I don't remember. Samuel goes, it just ain't here. It just ain't right. There's something missing. And he says, Jesse, is there somebody else? Well, yeah, we got David, running around chasing sheep. Well, bring him in. I want to take a look at this kid. And when Samuel saw him, he knew this little red-faced, freckled kid. It says David had a ruddy complexion. That's him. And here it is years later where he has received his kingship that he's reflecting about. How did I get here? Because God showed favor on me. He realized how God had shown him grace and it was time to pass it on. Now, grace is not just a New Testament concept. I know some of us think that. This story is clearly an example of grace in the Old Testament. So what can we learn from this story? What can we learn? The story of God's grace toward us, and it reveals where we can find grace. So let me finish with some points here. Number 1, grace will find you first. Grace will find you first. David asked, is there not yet any of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God unto him? In our story, grace began in the throne room. Our grace begins in the throne room and seeks us out just like David sought the descendants of Saul. Like Mephibosheth, before we were even aware of grace at all, it was already seeking us out. We kind of messed up in the Garden of Eden. Papa John gave a sermon not too long ago on that. Things kind of fell off the rails. But there was a plan, even at that point, that grace would bring us home. And God's grace remembers us. We have a favorite song that we sing here sometimes in Lexington. He knows my name, no matter where I go. Forgotten by his nation, abandoned by his family, with no real reason to remember Mephibosheth, but out of God's grace, working through King David, he remembered this crippled man. Now, it was kind of interesting when they were telling him about Mephibosheth. They kind of throw in that, this poor guy's crippled. I think probably to kind of play on the sympathy of the king, maybe a little. But don't remember him. David didn't remember him because of what he could get out of doing this favor. David was motivated by pure grace. And God's grace pursues us no matter where we go. No matter if it's low bar. I have a commentary Bible, and it says that translates into no pasture, barren, desolate, destitute. He was living in an armpit of a place, we might say. But there is no place on earth that anyone can go that God and grace can't find you there. It found the prodigal son. Remember him? He partied away his money, and the Jewish kid is fighting pigs for pig slop to eat. Something convicted him to go on home. Swallow your pride, young man. Go on home. Grace led him there. And Joseph, remember the story of Joseph. They found him in a pit dug by his brothers, and somehow he's lifted as high as second in command of Egypt. And the Samaritan woman, we've talked about her. She's going to the well in the heat of the day to get her water because, she's the gossip talk of town. She doesn't want to listen to the people muttering and accusing and stuff they say. Grace brought her to Jesus that day at the well. Like David, he sends out his message of grace through us. through us. Do you realize that we today help spread grace to others? No matter where you may be today, grace will find you there and change your life. He promises. Pinky swear promise. Number 2, grace is where you abandon your crippled past. David had summoned Mephibosheth, but it was up to him to respond. He didn't have to come. He did, but he didn't have to. Although grace is offered to us, it is our choice to embrace it. It is our choice to say yes. Not only had Mephibosheth's feet been crippled, but his whole life had been as well. He could have let bitterness keep him in Lo-debar, blaming David for his fate. He could have let fear in his bitterness. Skipped a line. He could have let his bitterness keep him away, because David is just a bloody man. We know he's a man of war. In his handicap and in his path had left him worthless, useless, calling himself dead dog or dead meat. How transforming it must have been for him to realize that he had value in the eyes of the king. Value in the eyes of King David, we have value in the eyes of our King. When you awaken to the reality that he finds you precious and valuable to him, it just drives out our crippled mentality. And we don't have to be physically crippled, we can be mentally crippled. People that beat up on themselves for no apparent reason. The I can'ts, I shouldn'ts, I am not worthy. I just have to do better and strive harder and I'm still not good enough. Somehow I don't think that exists in our relationship with God. If there's barriers, it's because we put them there ourselves. Number 3, grace is where you discover who you were born to be. Maybe as a boy, Mephibosheth dreamed about what it would be like someday to be the king, like his grandpa Saul. But those dreams were taken away. And now David looked down upon him and restored everything. We read all the land would be restored, everything that Saul owned. And David took him into his presence at his very table. He didn't send him off somewhere. Well, Mephibosheth, I've got a nice little villa down on the Dead Sea. You and your family can move there. We'll check on you every now and then. No, he brought him into his very presence. David's very presence at his table. As long as David sat on the throne, Mephibosheth would never have to worry about anyone taking his royal seat away. Anything he needed, anytime, any day, it was his. Hello, room service? Lastly, grace is where you embrace God's favor at his son's expense. Mephibosheth wasn't receiving grace on the basis of what he had done. No way. But on the basis of what his father had done. On the basis of what Jonathan had done. Verse 7, remember it says, "For Jonathan, thy father's sake, for the sake of the father, I do this." Likewise, we are not receiving God's favor on the grounds of our own goodness or our works, but on the basis of the works of Jesus Christ. Through his salvation, and what did I say earlier? Salvation got us here, but grace is what keeps us going. Grace has been called God's reward at Christ's expense. In conclusion, I'd like to ask some few questions. Are you embracing the grace that God allows you? Do you have some sort of barrier? Sure, we're all good Christians. We're here every week. We come to listen. And I see the smiles in the faces, but I don't always know what's inside those heads. Is there still doubt? Is there still questions? Is there still something that you are dragging around from your past? Grace is seeking you. Bottom line. You and you and you and anybody that know at some point. You too. If you're lost, you can grow His grace right now. But you've got to take it. You can grow the seeds, but you got to plant them. If you're a believer and found yourself in a place where you need His grace, wow, you can be a believer and still grow out grace. That's an interesting concept. But His grace, we know, is available for you as well. Come today. This could be your day of grace. Amen.